The telephone line crackled with static as Adolf Galland gripped the receiver, his knuckles white with tension. On the other end, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's voice boomed with fury. "You expect me to believe American fighters are escorting bombers all the way to Germany? Galland, you're either incompetent or a liar." It was August 17, 1943, and the General der Jagdflieger, the general of fighter pilots, had just delivered the most critical intelligence report of his career. Minutes earlier, his pilots had engaged American P-38 Lightning fighters over Schweinfurt, hundreds of miles from their supposed operational limit. The twin-engine fighters had torn through German interceptors like wolves among sheep, protecting the massive bomber formations that were methodically destroying German ball-bearing factories below. "Herr Reichsmarschall, I have confirmation from 12 separate pilots," Galland insisted, his Austrian accent sharpening with frustration. "The Americans have extended the range of their P-38s. They're using drop tanks." "Impossible." Göring's roar nearly shattered the earpiece. "My intelligence staff has assured me the Americans lack the capability." "You're seeing things that aren't there, Galland. Perhaps the strain of command has affected your judgment." Adolf Galland stood in his operations room at Luftwaffe headquarters, surrounded by maps studded with red pins marking each devastating raid. At 31 years old, he was Germany's youngest general, a decorated ace with 104 confirmed kills. His pilots trusted him because he'd flown with them, bled with them, mourned their losses. And now, when they needed him most, the man who controlled Germany's air defense refused to listen. "Sir, with respect, my pilots don't lie about what they see in combat," Galland said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "If we don't adapt our tactics immediately, there will be no change in tactics based on phantom aircraft." Göring snapped. "The American fighters cannot reach our homeland. This is a fact established by our technical experts. What you saw were probably captured Messerschmitts flown by traitors, or perhaps your men are simply making excuses for their poor performance." The accusation hit Galland like a physical blow. His pilots were dying at a rate of 20% per mission, burning alive in their cockpits or plummeting to earth in shattered aircraft. They weren't making excuses, they were drowning in an aerial war they couldn't win, and the one man who could help them had just called them liars. Galland's jaw clenched as he stared at the mission reports scattered across his desk. Fresh intelligence photographs showed something else Göring refused to believe. The Americans were already building more P-38s, modifying them, extending their range even further. Within months, they'd be able to escort bombers to Berlin itself. "Herr Reichsmarschall," Galland said quietly, "I respectfully request permission to present my evidence in person. The photographs, the gun camera footage, the testimony." "Request denied. I have more important matters than entertaining your delusions, Galland. Concentrate on improving your pilot's fighting spirit instead of inventing excuses. Heil Hitler." The line went dead. Galland slowly replaced the receiver, his mind racing. Around him, his staff officers stood frozen, having heard every word through the office's poor soundproofing. Their faces showed what he felt: disbelief, anger, and something more dangerous. The first seeds of doubt in their supreme leadership. Outside the window, the late summer sun was setting over Germany. In 6 hours, the American bombers would return. And this time, Galland knew with absolute certainty, those impossible long-range fighters would be with them again. The question was, how many of his pilots would die before Göring admitted the truth? Before we continue with this incredible true story, if you're finding this as gripping as we are, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you won't believe where this goes. And give us a thumbs up if you think Galland was right to stand up to Göring. This kind of content takes hours to research and produce, and your support means everything. 3 weeks earlier, on a scorching July afternoon, Adolf Galland had been a different man. Confident, optimistic even. He'd stood on the tarmac at Wevelgem Airfield in Belgium, watching his newest pilots climb into their Messerschmitt Bf 109s for their first combat patrol. They were so young, these boys. 18, 19 years old. Fresh faces that reminded him of his younger brother Paul, who'd been killed in action 2 years earlier. "Remember," Galland had called out to them, his voice carrying across the flight line, "the Americans fly in tight formations. Break them apart, isolate the stragglers. Their bombers are tough, but without fighter escort deep into Germany, they're vulnerable. That had been the doctrine, the strategy that had worked for 2 years. American daylight bombing raids were costly for both sides, but the Luftwaffe maintained air superiority over the Reich because of one simple fact. American fighters couldn't fly far enough to protect their bombers all the way to the target and back. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, barely 20 years old with eager blue eyes and an iron cross already pinned to his chest, had saluted sharply. What about their fighters, Herr General? The P-47 Thunderbolts. Galland had smiled reassuringly. The Thunderbolts turned back at the German border. They don't have the range. Once the bombers cross into our airspace, they're ours. How wrong he'd been. That very afternoon, Weber's squadron had intercepted a formation of B-17 flying fortresses over Hanover. The attack had proceeded as planned initially. Galland's pilots diving through the bomber formation, cannons blazing, watching the big 4-engine aircraft shudder under the impact of 20mm shells. 2 bombers had already fallen, trailing smoke and flame, when the impossible happened. Twin-engine fighters had appeared from nowhere, their distinctive twin-boom design unmistakable even at combat speeds. P-38 Lightnings. Hundreds of miles beyond where intelligence said they could operate. Weber had radioed frantically. Indianer. The code word for enemy fighters. But it was too late. The P-38s, with their heavy armament of 120mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose, had torn into the German formation with devastating effect. 3 Messerschmitts had gone down in the first pass. Weber himself had survived only because his engine had been hit, forcing him to break off and limp back to base on emergency power. He'd landed wheels up in a Belgian farmer's field, his aircraft a smoking wreck, but he was alive. When Galland had arrived at the field hospital that evening, he'd found Weber in a bed, his left arm bandaged from burns, but his eyes were what troubled Galland most. They held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen something that fundamentally changed his understanding of the war. "They were waiting for us, Herr General," Weber had whispered, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Not responding to our attack, waiting. Like they knew exactly when and where we'd strike." Galland had pulled up a chair, leaning close. "Tell me everything, Klaus. Every detail." Over the next hour, Weber had described how the P-38s had positioned themselves above and behind the bomber formation, how they'd maintained perfect formation discipline, how their pilots had shown none of the hesitation typical of fighters operating at the extreme edge of their range. These weren't aircraft on a desperate gamble, stretching their fuel to the limit. These were fighters operating comfortably within their operational envelope. "They had drop tanks, sir," Weber had said, and this detail had made Galland's blood run cold. "External fuel tanks under their wings. I saw them jettison them before engaging. That's how they're doing it, they're carrying extra fuel." The technology itself wasn't revolutionary. The Luftwaffe used drop tanks too. But the Americans had solved the engineering problem of creating reliable, large-capacity external tanks that could extend the P-38's range by hundreds of miles. It was a game-changer, and apparently, German intelligence had completely missed it. Galland had immediately sent a priority report to Göring's headquarters, detailing Weber's account and requesting an emergency conference. The response had come back within hours. Unconfirmed report. Single pilot testimony unreliable. No action required. But Galland couldn't let it go. Over the next 2 weeks, he'd quietly conducted his own investigation, interviewing every pilot who'd engaged American fighters deep over German territory. The pattern was undeniable. The P-38s were there, and they were getting better at their job with each mission. He'd compiled photographic evidence from gun cameras, testimonies from 24 pilots, even salvaged parts from a downed P-38 that showed the mounting hardware for external fuel tanks. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. And yet, when he'd finally gotten Göring on the phone on August 17th, the Reichsmarschall had dismissed everything. Now, standing in his office after that disastrous phone call, Galland made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He would bypass Göring entirely and take his evidence directly to someone who might actually listen, even if it meant risking court-martial for breaking the chain of command. The knock on Galland's door came at 2 a.m., sharp and urgent. He'd been awake anyway, hunched over reconnaissance photographs by lamplight, comparing images of P-38s from 6 months ago to current shots. The modifications were visible if you knew what to look for. Reinforced wing pylons, redesigned fuel tank attachment points. "Come in," he called. Major Gunther Lutzow entered, still wearing his flight suit, his face grim. Lutzow was one of Galland's most trusted squadron commanders, a veteran ace with 108 confirmed kills. If Lutzow looked worried, there was reason. "We lost 8 aircraft tonight," Lutzow said without preamble. "The Americans hit Frankfurt. The P-38s were there again, and this time they brought P-47 Thunderbolts too, also with drop tanks. They're coordinating, Adolf. Different fighter types covering different altitudes, rotating coverage so the bombers are never unprotected." Galland felt his stomach turn. 8 pilots. 8 men he'd trained, flown with, shared meals with. 8 families who'd received telegram notifications before sunrise. "Casualties?" he asked quietly. 5 dead. 2 critically wounded. 1 bailed out and broke both legs on landing. Lutzow moved to the map on Galland's wall, pointing to the red pins clustered around Frankfurt. "They're learning our tactics faster than we can adapt. When we attack from above, the P-38s climb to meet us. When we try head-on passes, the P-47s dive on us. It's like fighting a hydra, cut off one head and 2 more appear." Galland stood, moving to the window. Dawn was breaking over the airfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In the distance, mechanics were already working on aircraft, preparing for the next mission. They never stopped, these men. Even as the odds grew worse, they kept fighting. "I called Göring yesterday," Galland said. "Presented him with everything we know about the P-38's extended range. And he called me a liar." Lutzow's jaw clenched. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" "Always, Gunther." The Reichsmarschall is living in a fantasy world. He's surrounded by yes-men who tell him what he wants to hear. Meanwhile, we're losing this air war, and he's refusing to acknowledge basic facts. Lutzow's voice dropped lower. "The pilots are starting to talk, Adolf. They're saying if our own leadership won't protect us, why are we protecting them?" This was dangerous territory. Such talk could be considered defeatism, even treason. But Galland couldn't argue with the sentiment. How could he ask his men to die for leaders who denied the reality of what they faced? "I'm going to Berlin tomorrow," Galland said suddenly. "I'm going to request an audience with Albert Speer." Lutzow's eyes widened. Albert Speer was Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, one of the few men in the Nazi hierarchy who valued technical expertise over political loyalty. He was also someone who might actually understand the strategic implications of what Galland was reporting. "That's bypassing the entire Luftwaffe command structure," Lutzow said. "If Göring finds out, then I'll be relieved of command, possibly court-martialed." Galland turned from the window, his expression resolute. "But if I don't do something, Gunther, we'll have lost the air war by Christmas. The Americans are building a fighter escort capability that makes every German city vulnerable to daylight bombing. Our aircraft production facilities, our oil refineries, our transportation networks, everything becomes a target once they can escort their bombers anywhere." He moved back to his desk, pulling out a folder thick with reports. "Look at these production numbers. The Americans built 2,500 P-38s last year. This year, they're on track for 4,000. And now they've figured out how to make each one count for twice as much by extending its range. Meanwhile, our fighter production is being bombed into oblivion, and Göring is pretending the problem doesn't exist." Lutzow studied the documents, his expression growing darker. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to command the fighter wings while I'm in Berlin. More importantly, I need you to document everything. Every engagement with long-range American fighters. Gun camera footage, pilot testimonies, salvaged aircraft parts, anything that proves I'm not imagining this. Consider it done." Lutzow hesitated, then added, "Adolf, you know they might not just relieve you of command. Göring has had officers executed for less than going over his head." Galland smiled grimly. Then I'd better make sure Speer finds my evidence convincing enough to protect me. Because the alternative, watching my pilots die while doing nothing, that's not something I can live with. After Lutzow left, Galland sat alone in the pre-dawn darkness, organizing his evidence into a presentation that might save the Luftwaffe, or end his career. Outside, the first fighters were taking off for morning patrol, their engines roaring defiance at the coming American bombers. Somewhere over the North Sea, those bombers were already forming up, and flying protective circles around them were the impossible P-38s that would soon turn the tide of the air war. Now, we want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. We've got viewers from over 50 countries following this channel, and we love seeing where our community is tuning in from. Are you watching from Texas? London? Sydney? Let us know. The train to Berlin felt like a journey into another world. As Galland stared out the window at the German countryside rolling past, he saw the evidence of American bombing everywhere. Shattered rail yards, factories reduced to skeletal frameworks, entire neighborhoods flattened. Yet in Berlin, he knew, the Nazi leadership still spoke of inevitable victory, of wonder weapons that would turn the tide of war. The capital itself seemed trapped in a strange duality when Galland arrived that afternoon. Streets were damaged but bustling, people moved with purpose but their eyes carried exhaustion, and everywhere were posters proclaiming German supremacy while anti-aircraft guns bristled from every rooftop. Galland had managed to secure his meeting with Speer through a contact in the ministry, an old friend from his pre-war racing days who now worked in armaments procurement. The meeting was scheduled for 4 p.m. at Speer's office in the Reich Chancellery, giving Galland just enough time to rehearse his presentation one more time. When he was finally ushered into Speer's office, Galland was struck by how different it was from Göring's ostentatious headquarters. Where Göring surrounded himself with looted art and Baroque furniture, Speer's workspace was austere and functional. Drafting tables covered with blueprints, walls lined with production charts, a simple desk buried under technical reports. Speer himself was 40 years old, tall and angular, with the intense focus of a man constantly solving impossible problems. He looked up from a set of factory schematics and studied Galland with sharp, analytical eyes. "General Galland," Speer said, gesturing to a chair. "Your reputation precedes you. My engineers speak highly of your technical knowledge." He paused. "They also say you're one of the few officers who tells uncomfortable truths." "That's why I'm here, Minister," Galland replied, setting his briefcase on the desk. "I need to tell you a truth that the Luftwaffe command refuses to acknowledge." Over the next hour, Galland laid out his case with the precision of a prosecutor. He showed Speer the reconnaissance photographs, the gun camera footage of P-38s with drop tanks, the interrogation reports from captured American pilots who freely discussed their extended range capabilities. He presented casualty statistics showing German fighter losses spiking precisely when deep penetration escort missions began. Speer listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad. Unlike Göring, he asked technical questions about fuel consumption rates, about the engineering challenges of drop tank design, about the strategic implications for German industrial production. "The Americans are systematically destroying our aircraft factories," Galland concluded, pointing to a map marked with recent bombing targets. Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Wiener Neustadt, all major production centers hit in the last month. And now that they can escort their bombers all the way to these targets, our interception capabilities are severely compromised. Speer leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I've read the Luftwaffe's intelligence assessments. They claim American fighters lack the range for deep penetration missions. With respect, Minister, those assessments are wrong. Dangerously wrong." Galland pulled out his final piece of evidence. Technical drawings salvaged from a crashed P-38, showing the drop tank mounting system. "The Americans have solved the engineering problem. These external tanks are disposable, lightweight, and give their fighters an additional 300 miles of range. It's not theoretical. It's happening over Germany right now every day." For a long moment, Speer studied the drawings in silence. Then he stood and walked to his window, looking out over bomb-scarred Berlin. "Do you know what keeps me awake at night, General?" Speer asked quietly. "It's not the bombing itself, it's the mathematics. The Americans are outproducing us 4-1 in aircraft, 5-1 in heavy bombers. And those numbers are getting worse every month. He turned back to Galland. If what you're telling me is true, if they can now protect those bombers all the way to any target in Germany, then we've already lost the air war. We just haven't admitted it yet. We haven't lost, Galland said firmly. But we need to adapt immediately. We need faster fighters, better tactics, concentrated forces. Most importantly, we need leadership that acknowledges reality. Speer's expression became carefully neutral. You're asking me to contradict the Reichsmarschall's intelligence assessments. I'm asking you to look at evidence and make your own judgment. General, do you understand what you're really asking? Speer moved closer, his voice dropping. Göring is the designated successor to the Führer. Challenging his competence, especially on military matters, is extraordinarily dangerous. Even for you. Even for me. Galland met his gaze steadily. More dangerous than letting American bombers destroy every factory in Germany because we're pretending their escort fighters don't exist? Speer was quiet for a long moment, then smiled, a cold, analytical expression. You've made your case well, General. Give me 2 days. I'll review your evidence with my technical staff and make my own assessment. He extended his hand. But understand this. If I confirm what you're saying is true, the political consequences will be severe. For both of us. They shook hands, and Galland felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. That hope lasted exactly 18 hours. The next morning, Galland was awakened at his Berlin hotel by urgent pounding on his door. It was Major Lutzow who'd flown through the night to reach him, his face ashen. Adolf, you need to come back immediately, Lutzow said. There's been a disaster. Yesterday's mission to Stuttgart, we lost 23 aircraft. 23. The Americans brought over 300 escort fighters, and they massacred us. But that's not the worst part. What's the worst part? Galland asked, though he already dreaded the answer. Göring has called an emergency conference for tomorrow. All fighter commanders. He's learned about your meeting with Speer. Lutzow's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Adolf, he's accusing you of spreading defeatist propaganda and undermining the Luftwaffe's command authority. There are whispers he might have you arrested. The trap had sprung. Galland had gambled everything on convincing someone in power to listen to the truth. Now it seemed that gamble might cost him not just his career, but his life. The conference room in Göring's Carinhall estate was designed to intimidate. Massive oak beams crossed the vaulted ceiling. Walls were lined with priceless paintings looted from across conquered Europe, and at the head of an enormous table sat Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself. Draped in a powder blue uniform laden with medals, his corpulent frame barely contained by his chair. Galland entered with 12 other fighter commanders, all men he'd flown with and trusted. The atmosphere was toxic with tension. Everyone knew why they'd been summoned. Gentlemen, Göring began, his voice deceptively pleasant. We gather today to discuss a disturbing trend, the spread of defeatist rumors that undermine our fighting spirit and comfort our enemies. His eyes locked onto Galland. General Galland, perhaps you'd like to explain why you've been telling certain government ministers that the Luftwaffe is incapable of defending the Reich? The accusation hung in the air like a physical thing. Galland stood slowly, aware that every word he spoke now could mean the difference between vindication and execution. Herr Reichsmarschall, I've told Minister Speer the truth about American fighter capabilities. The same truth I attempted to share with you on August 17th. Our pilots are encountering long-range escort fighters on every deep penetration mission. This is not rumor, it's documented fact. Göring's face reddened. Fact? You dare speak of facts? I have reports from my intelligence staff stating categorically that American fighters lack the range to escort bombers beyond the French border. Are you suggesting my entire intelligence apparatus is incompetent? I'm suggesting they're receiving incorrect information, sir, Galland replied carefully. Or perhaps information that's become outdated. The Americans have developed drop tank technology that... Enough. Göring slammed his fist on the table, making several officers jump. I will not sit here and listen to excuses for poor performance. The truth is simple, Galland. Your pilots are failing because they lack fighting spirit, not because of phantom American capabilities. Major Lutzow stood, his face flushed with anger. Herr Reichsmarschall, with respect, we've lost 31 pilots in the last week alone. These were not cowards. These were experienced aces. I myself have engaged P-38 Lightnings over Frankfurt, aircraft that should not have had the fuel to be there according to our intelligence estimates. Then perhaps your navigation was faulty, Major. Göring sneered. Or perhaps you're simply supporting your commander's fantasies because you lack the spine to admit German pilots are being outfought. The insult was too much. Around the table, Galland saw his fellow commanders bristling, hands clenching. These were men who'd flown thousands of combat hours, who'd watched friends die, who'd bled for Germany. To be called cowards by a man who hadn't flown a combat mission in years was unbearable. But before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened. An aide entered, visibly nervous, carrying a folder marked with urgent classification stamps. Herr Reichsmarschall, the aide stammered. Forgive the interruption, but Minister Speer insisted this reach you immediately. It's marked highest priority. Göring snatched the folder irritably, broke the seal, and began reading. Galland watched as the Reichsmarschall's expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that might have been fear. The room fell silent as Göring read page after page. Finally, he looked up, and for the first time, Galland saw uncertainty in his eyes. This report, Göring said slowly, is from Minister Speer's Technical Assessment Division. They've analyzed the evidence General Galland provided. He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. They confirm that American P-38 and P-47 fighters are indeed operating with extended-range capabilities using disposable external fuel tanks. Furthermore, they project that within 3 months, the Americans will introduce a new fighter, the P-51 Mustang, with sufficient range to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The room erupted in murmurs. Galland felt vindication wash over him, but it was a hollow victory. Being right about a disaster didn't make the disaster any less catastrophic. Göring's face had gone pale beneath his makeup. The report concludes that if current trends continue, the Luftwaffe will lose air superiority over Germany by January 1944. He set the folder down with shaking hands. Minister Speer recommends immediate emergency measures. Concentrated fighter production, development of jet aircraft, complete reorganization of defense strategy. One of the older commanders, Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, spoke up. Herr Reichsmarschall, with respect, General Galland has been telling us this for weeks. If we'd acted on his intelligence when he first reported it. Are you suggesting this is my fault? Göring's voice rose dangerously. That I'm responsible for American technological advances? No, sir, Galland interjected, trying to defuse the situation. But we are responsible for how we respond. The Americans have changed the game. We need to change with them immediately, or we will lose not just air superiority but the entire war. Göring stared at him for a long moment, and Galland saw something unexpected in those eyes. Not anger but desperation. The Reichsmarschall had built his entire reputation on Luftwaffe invincibility. Admitting that invincibility was a lie would destroy him politically. Possibly physically. This conference is adjourned, Göring said abruptly. General Galland, you will remain. The rest of you are dismissed. As the other officers filed out, several squeezed Galland's shoulder in silent support. Lutzow lingered at the door until Göring barked at him to leave. When they were alone, Göring stood and walked to the window, his back to Galland. For a long time, neither man spoke. Do you know what the Führer will do to me if I admit we're losing the air war? Göring finally asked, his voice barely audible. Galland chose his words carefully. I know what will happen to Germany if we don't adapt to this new reality. Göring turned, and for the first time, Galland saw him as he truly was. Not the bombastic, medal-bedecked Reichsmarschall, but a frightened, aging man watching his world crumble. What do you need? Göring asked simply. What would you have done in Galland's position? Would you have pushed for even more changes, or would you have been cautious knowing how dangerous the political situation was? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, Smash that like button and share this video with anyone who loves real World War II history. These incredible true stories deserve to be told. 3 weeks after the Carinhall conference, Galland stood on the tarmac at Tempelhof Airfield in Berlin, watching the sun glint off the sleek aluminum skin of Germany's future, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. The twin-engine aircraft looked like nothing else in the sky, its swept wings and revolutionary turbojet engines promising speeds approaching 540 miles per hour. Fast enough to outrun any American fighter. Fast enough to change everything. She's beautiful, isn't she? Colonel Wolfgang Spate said beside him, one of the test pilots selected for the jet program. Climbs like a rocket, turns like a dream. The Americans won't know what hit them. But Galland's expression was troubled as he studied the production schedule in his hands. We have 12 operational Me-262s. The Americans are sending over 1,000 bombers at a time, protected by 500 fighters. Beautiful doesn't win wars, Wolfgang. Numbers do. The previous 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Göring had authorized emergency measures, increased fighter production, concentration of defensive forces, and accelerated development of jet aircraft. But the Reichsmarschall had also made a catastrophic decision that Galland had fought against unsuccessfully. Hitler himself had ordered that the Me-262 be modified as a bomber, not a fighter. The Führer wants revenge weapons, Göring had explained at a follow-up meeting, avoiding Galland's eyes. Fast bombers that can strike London without being intercepted. He believes this will break British morale. Galland had been incredulous. We're being bombed into rubble daily, and he wants to use our only technological advantage as a propaganda weapon? Herr Reichsmarschall, the Me-262 as a fighter could potentially regain air superiority over Germany. As a light bomber, it's a waste of resources we don't have. But Hitler had spoken, and in Nazi Germany, Hitler's word was law, no matter how strategically insane. Now, standing beside the magnificent jet aircraft, Galland felt the weight of opportunities slipping away. Intelligence reports showed the Americans were already developing their own jet fighters. The window of German technological superiority was measured in months, not years, and they were squandering it. General Galland. A runner approached at double time, saluting breathlessly. Sir, there's an urgent call from Fighter Command. Major Lutzow is reporting a massive raid developing. Over 400 bombers heading for Munich. Galland's heart sank. Munich meant the BMW engine factories, critical to German aircraft production. He turned to Spate. Get me in the air. I'm leading the intercept personally. Spate's eyes widened. Sir, General der Jagdflieger don't fly combat missions. If something happens to you, if something happens to Munich's factories, we lose 30% of our engine production, Galland cut him off. I won't ask my pilots to face something I won't face myself. Get me an aircraft. Now. 20 minutes later, Galland was strapped into the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, part of a hastily assembled force of 80 fighters scrambling to intercept the American raid. As he climbed through scattered clouds over Bavaria, his radio crackled with transmissions from other aircraft, a chaotic symphony of warnings, target calls, and increasingly desperate situation reports. Indianer at Angels 20. Multiple groups. I count at least 100 P-38s, maybe more. They're everywhere. Achtung! P-47s diving from the sun. Galland's tactical display painted a grim picture. The Americans had brought overwhelming force, not just bombers, but a massive fighter escort operating in coordinated layers. P-47 Thunderbolts flew high cover. P-38 Lightnings provided close escort, and according to the latest reports, there were even a few of the new P-51 Mustangs in the mix, testing their capabilities. At 24,000 feet, Galland got his first visual on the bomber formation. It stretched for miles, a vast metallic constellation of B-17 flying fortresses moving inexorably toward Munich. The sight should have been terrifying, but Galland felt only a strange calm. This was what he'd been warning about for months. Now everyone would see the truth. All units, this is Galland, he transmitted. Attack in pairs. Focus on the bombers. Don't get drawn into fighter duels. We're outnumbered 3-1. His own wingman was a 19-year-old lieutenant named Franz Stigler, a capable pilot with sharp instincts. Together, they dove on the bomber formation, Galland selecting a B-17 on the formation's edge. His cannon fire walked across the bomber's wing, and he saw pieces of metal tear away. But the big aircraft maintained formation, its own gunners returning fire with streams of .50 caliber tracers. Then the P-38s arrived. Galland saw them coming from above and behind. 4 twin-boomed fighters in perfect formation, their nose-mounted guns already flashing. He broke hard right, pulling his Bf-109 into a tight spiral, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat. Stigler stayed with him, the 2 aircraft dancing through a deadly aerial ballet. But Galland's attention was drawn to something else, the coordination of the American attack. The P-38s weren't just fighting individually. They were working as a team, covering each other, communicating, executing complex tactics. These weren't the hesitant, fuel-conscious pilots of 6 months ago. These were masters of their craft, operating with complete confidence in their aircraft's capabilities. A Bf-109 exploded to Galland's left, hit by a devastating burst from a P-38. Another German fighter fell moments later, its pilot bailing out, parachute blossoming white against the blue sky. "They're cutting us to pieces," someone screamed over the radio. Galland forced emotion aside, focusing on survival and mission completion. He made 2 more passes at the bomber formation, damaging another B-17, but the cost was terrible. Every minute, more German fighters fell. The sky filled with parachutes and smoke trails. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the P-51 Mustangs, painted in distinctive red and white stripes, was systematically hunting German fighters, destroying them with clinical precision. The pilot was exceptional, aggressive but disciplined, and the P-51 itself was a revelation. It turned tighter than a P-38, climbed faster than a P-47, and seemed to have unlimited fuel. This was the future. And Germany was on the wrong side of it. "All units, disengage and return to base," Galland ordered, his voice heavy. "We can't stop them today." As he turned his aircraft toward home, Galland looked back at the bomber formation, still intact, still heading for Munich. The P-38s and P-51s circled protectively, untouchable. Below, Munich's factories were about to be devastated, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. They'd lost 32 fighters in the engagement. The Americans had lost 4. When Galland landed back at base, his crew chief noticed something. The general's aircraft was riddled with bullet holes, far more than usual. Galland had been in mortal danger up there and hadn't said a word about it to anyone. "Sir," the crew chief said, running his hand over the damaged fuselage, "you were lucky today." Galland removed his flight helmet, his hair soaked with sweat, his hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. "Luck had nothing to do with it, Hans. The Americans simply have better equipment and more of it. That's not luck, that's industrial superiority." He walked to his office and immediately began writing his report. Göring needed to know, they all needed to know, that the air war wasn't just being lost. It was already over. Germany was simply going through the motions until the inevitable end. The question now was how many more pilots would die before that end came. December 1943. Snow fell gently on the Luftwaffe headquarters as Adolf Galland sat in his office, staring at the casualty reports that had become his constant companion. 4 months since he'd first warned Göring about the P-38s. 4 months of watching his predictions come true in the most painful way possible. The numbers told a story more brutal than any words could convey. German fighter pilot casualties had increased by 300%. American bomber formations now reached any target in Germany with relative impunity. The new P-51 Mustang, with its revolutionary Merlin engine and incredible range, was appearing in ever greater numbers, and it was proving to be the finest fighter aircraft in the sky. Even Germany's vaunted aces were falling before it. On his desk lay a letter from young Klaus Weber's mother. The lieutenant who'd first reported the long-range P-38s back in July had been killed 2 weeks ago over Bremen, shot down by a P-51. He was 20 years old. His mother wanted to know if her son had died for something meaningful, if his sacrifice mattered. Galland didn't know how to answer that letter. A knock interrupted his dark thoughts. Major Lutzow entered, carrying a bottle of schnapps and 2 glasses. Without asking permission, he poured drinks for both of them. To the fallen, Lutzow said quietly, raising his glass. They drank in silence. Outside, mechanics worked on damaged aircraft, preparing them for tomorrow's inevitable missions. The work never stopped, even as the losses mounted. I heard from a contact in Berlin, Lutzow said after a moment. There was a meeting yesterday between Hitler, Göring, and Speer. Göring apparently broke down, admitted that the Luftwaffe has lost control of German airspace. Hitler was apoplectic. Galland felt no satisfaction at the news. And Göring blamed you. Of course he did. That was Göring's way. Never accept responsibility, always find a scapegoat. Galland had become that scapegoat, the man who dared to tell uncomfortable truths. He told Hitler that if you'd inspired better fighting spirit in the pilots, if you'd implemented proper tactics, if you'd believed in German superiority instead of spreading defeatism, the air war would have gone differently. Lutzow's voice dripped with contempt. He's rewriting history, Adolf, making it seem like you were the problem all along, not his incompetence. Galland laughed bitterly. Let him. History will remember what really happened. The reports are all there. My warnings, his dismissals, the evidence he refused to acknowledge. Future generations will know the truth. That's assuming there are future generations of Germans left to read those reports, Lutzow said darkly. He poured another drink. Adolf, you need to hear this. There's talk of removing you as General der Jagdflieger. Göring wants someone who'll be more optimistic in their assessments. Someone who'll lie, you mean? Someone who'll tell him what he wants to hear, yes. Galland stood and walked to his window, looking out at the snow-covered airfield. A group of new pilots, boys, really, barely old enough to shave, were receiving instruction on aircraft recognition. They looked so eager, so confident, just like Klaus Weber had looked 6 months ago. Do you know what the worst part is, Gunther? Galland said softly. It's not that Göring ignored my warnings. It's not even that we're losing. It's that we could have adapted. If we'd acknowledged the threat in August, if we'd concentrated our fighter production, if we'd deployed the Me-262 as a fighter instead of wasting it as a bomber, we might not have one, but we could have made the Americans pay such a price that they'd have reconsidered their daylight bombing strategy. He turned back to Lutzow. Instead, we pretended the problem didn't exist. We called reality impossible, because it was inconvenient. And now thousands of pilots are dead, dozens of cities are rubble, and our industrial capacity is being systematically destroyed. All because one man couldn't admit he was wrong. The office door burst open suddenly. An aide stood there, breathless, holding a decoded message. General. Priority alert from radar stations. Massive American raid forming over England. Estimated 1,200 bombers with equal number of escorts. Target unknown but likely Berlin. Berlin. The capital itself. Once untouchable, now just another target on the Americans' list. Galland felt a strange calm settle over him. This was it. The culmination of everything he'd been warning about. The Americans were demonstrating beyond any doubt that they could strike anywhere in Germany, anytime they wanted, with overwhelming force. Sound the alert, he ordered. Scramble all available fighters. I'm leading the intercept personally. Sir, the aide protested. Regulations state that. I know what regulations state, Galland cut him off. But those pilots out there are going into hell, and I won't watch from the ground. Get me an aircraft. As Galland strapped into his Bf-109 30 minutes later, he knew this mission was different from all the others. This wasn't about stopping the raid. That was impossible now. This was about bearing witness. About standing with his men in their darkest hour. About showing that at least one German general wouldn't abandon his pilots, even when the cause was lost. The intercept was exactly as catastrophic as he'd expected. The American formation was so vast it took minutes to fly past. German fighters threw themselves at the bombers with desperate courage, and the sky filled with burning aircraft, mostly German. The P-51 Mustangs ruled the air, their silver wings flashing in the winter sun as they cut through German formations with impunity. Galland himself shot down a B-17, his 105th and final victory of the war. But he took no joy in it. Around him, pilots he'd trained and flown with were dying. The radio was full of final transmissions. "I'm hit, bailing out, tell my wife," and then silence. When he finally landed, his aircraft damaged and nearly out of fuel, Galland found a message waiting. He was ordered to report to Berlin immediately. Göring wanted to see him. The meeting was brief and brutal. Göring, looking haggard and defeated, informed Galland that he was being relieved as General der Jagdflieger, effective immediately. The official reason was differences in strategic vision. The real reason was unstated but obvious. Galland had been right, and Göring couldn't forgive him for it. "You may return to operational flying if you wish," Göring said, not meeting Galland's eyes. "Your combat record is exemplary after all." "I'll take the operational assignment," Galland replied quietly. "At least there, when I fight the Americans, I'm fighting an honorable enemy, not my own leadership's delusions." The insult hung in the air, but Göring said nothing. What could he say? The evidence of his failure was burning in the skies above Berlin at that very moment. As Galland left the chancellery, he ran into Albert Speer in the hallway. The armaments minister looked exhausted, carrying folders full of damage reports. "I'm sorry, General," Speer said simply. "You tried to warn us." "We both tried," Galland corrected. "The difference is, I'm being punished for it. You're probably next." Speer smiled grimly. "Probably. But at least we tried, Adolf. At least we didn't simply accept comfortable lies." He paused. "For what it's worth, history will remember that you were right. That matters." "Does it?" Galland asked. "Klaus Weber is still dead. So are thousands of other pilots. Being right didn't save any of them." "No," Speer admitted. "But maybe your example will save someone in the future. Maybe some general in some future war will remember Adolf Galland, who told the truth even when it cost him everything. Maybe that general will speak up when his leaders prefer comfortable lies. And maybe, just maybe, that will save lives." It was a thin comfort, but it was something. Adolf Galland would spend the rest of the war commanding an elite jet fighter unit, flying the Me-262 in the role it should have played from the beginning. He would survive the war, write extensively about his experiences, and become a voice of military wisdom for future generations. He would live to see his warnings about ignoring reality validated in countless military studies and histories. But on that cold December day in 1943, walking away from Göring's headquarters, he felt only the weight of opportunities lost and lives wasted because one man had called reality impossible. The P-38s had been real. The extended-range fighters had been real. The American industrial might had been real. All of it had been real, observable, and documented. And Germany had lost the air war, not because its pilots lacked courage, not because its aircraft were inferior, but because its leadership had chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. In the end, that was Adolf Galland's real legacy. Not the 105 aircraft he shot down, not the medals he earned, but the lesson he taught. In war, as in life, reality doesn't care what you believe. It simply is. And those who refuse to acknowledge reality will be destroyed by it, no matter how many medals they wear or how loudly they proclaim their superiority. The P-38 Lightnings had proven that. And history would never forget. If this incredible true story moved you, hit that subscribe button now. We uncover forgotten World War II stories like this every week. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear about the courage it takes to speak truth to power, even when it costs everything. And let us know in the comments, what other untold stories from World War II should we cover next? Your support keeps these important histories alive. Until next time, remember, the truth always matters, even when it's inconvenient.